Creating sequels is an extremely common occurrence in the game industry, and making meaningful changes, especially in game AI, can be difficult and risky. Players have strong expectations based on the original title, and often aggressive production schedules leave little time for significantly rewriting existing features. Tom Clancy's The Division was the fastest-selling new IP in gaming history, and the follow-up game, Tom Clancy's The Division 2, has even greater expectations from both fans and Ubisoft alike. Good morning, and welcome to Fighting Sequelitis, Creating Combat NPCs for Tom Clancy's The Division 2. My name is Drew Reckner, and I'm the lead AI designer on The Division 2. I designed and authored most of the combat behaviors for our NPCs. I'll be sharing this talk with Phil Dunstan, our lead AI programmer. We're both from Massive Entertainment, which is a Ubisoft studio. Throughout the first half of the talk, I'll be focusing more on the design aspect of the game, whereas Phil will talk about some of the more technical aspects. Before we get started, though, a quick description of our game. Tom Clancy's The Division 2 is an open-world, online shooter RPG that takes place approximately 6 months after the original. Moving from the snowy streets of Manhattan to the muggy Washington, D.C. in the summer, we focused on expanding the player's strategic freedom and vastly improving the endgame at launch. Division 2 was just released last week on March 15th. On the AI side of things, we support both a dynamic open world and fairly linear missions with various systems, such as a detection system, threat system, scripted control, dynamic objective handling. Now, in order to accomplish this, we utilize a very low-level behavior tree scripting architecture in our proprietary Snowdrop engine. For more detailed information on any of these, you can see our previous talk at GDC 2016, called Blending Autonomy and Control, Creating NPCs for Tom Clancy's The Division. So, when we shipped The Division, we received a lot of feedback about the AI. Some of it was good. Some of it was not as good. Overall, though, we were proud what we managed to ship in The Division. Creating a new IP and a brand new engine with untested tools and workflows, it's challenging, right? Like, it's game dev on hard mode. But we knew there was room for improvement, too. Shortly after releasing The Division, we found out that we would be making a sequel at some point in the future. Despite having a pretty full plate of post-launch work, the NPC team, what we call our team responsible for AI, we decided to take time out of our schedule to perform a retrospective. We identified this as the best way to critique our work and figure out where we wanted to go in the future. As a team, that was important. We asked our team members to focus on gameplay only, not production. That would happen later. And we would create lists of what we did well, what we did that needed improvement, and new features we would like to add in the future. Now, I'm sure you all know how postmortems or retrospectives work, so I'm not going to go any deeper into that. But what is important, though, are the results of that and how it shaped our AI in The Division 2. The following slides identify some of the areas of our AI that we strove to improve in The Division 2, and we talk about how we address each. The first area of improvement identified was that there was a perception there wasn't enough differentiation between the factions. In The Division 1, each faction was essentially a tier of difficulty, and we simply added a new component to them as we climbed tiers. So, for example, we started off with pretty basic and simple faction, then we added stricter cover usage, we added a strafing and shooting, and then finally cover fire. Now, these changes were subtle, And so they also had an effect on difficulty, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Therefore, in the Division 2, we decided to really amplify the differences between the factions as much as possible, and we relied on something new we created called faction traits. Faction traits are comprised of 4 different aspects that define the behaviors of NPCs within a faction: aggression, organization, training, and tech level. When creating our 4 major factions and our several small sub-factions we call crews, we tried to diversify them using these traits. So we'll go through each trait here. The first trait, aggression, can have 2 possible variants: aggressive and defensive. Aggressive factions can be defined by a few chief characteristics. First, they're always attempting to close in on the enemy and shorten the combat space. Now, if you're familiar with the Division 1, that's essentially how all our factions worked. Now, in order to accomplish this, we essentially decrease the maximum distance the NPC wants to be away from their target when they attempt to move to a new cover. And we also kind of remove the optimal distance weighting on our cover finding algorithm. Next, aggressive factions reposition or advance to new cover positions slightly more often and with less caution than our defensive factions. When they get within close range, they'll actually abandon cover and switch to a really aggressive circle strafe around the target and shoot. Overall, we could characterize our aggressive factions as narrow, as they kind of funnel directly towards the target. By contrast, defensive factions prefer to stay at their optimal range from their target and only reposition when they're unable to hit their target for too long. They also generally prefer to spread out over time and attempt to overwhelm and surround the target. To do this, we slowly increase the desired distance from their allies that's used in our cover finding algorithm, and we combine that with the preference to stay near their optimal range. This gives us a spreading effect. Finally, defensive factions shoot with shorter shoot patterns than their aggressive counterparts, and they'll actually interrupt these if they take damage and their health is below a certain threshold. Overall, defensive factions, we could characterize them as wide, right? Because they like to spread out and surround. The next faction trait is organization, which essentially controls the barks and communication a faction uses, and it's mostly cosmetic. Now, we split this into 2 groups: organized, disorganized. Organized faction uses barks that reflect the hierarchy and order in both in and out of combat. They also utilize hand signaling and nonverbal communication throughout combat and non-combat, especially in their detection process. Disorganized factions, by contrast, use barks that reflect a lack of hierarchy and structure, and these factions might even argue with each other. There's extremely little or no hand signaling or other nonverbal communication cues, and that really helps set them apart from their organized counterparts. Our third faction trait is an important one: training. Training controls the combat aptitude of each faction, including their tactics, their reactions, and their decision-making. There are 3 variations here: untrained, trained, and highly trained. Untrained factions are low skill, which is reflected in both their gameplay and their visual aspects. During combat, untrained factions don't use cover fire for their allies, and they're far less likely to flank an opponent. Additionally, they have slow windups, and they're pretty inaccurate with things like skills and their weapon. On the animation side of things, they visually appear to move in a way that reflects poor to little training, and you might even see them trip as they try to vault over a cover, for example. And they also use slower animation transitions, such as when they pop out of cover to shoot, or when they attempt to scramble away from a grenade or any other player skill. Next, our trained factions. They're kind of the middle-of-the-road faction, and they use cover fire and occasionally attempt to flank the player when there's a good option nearby. They have normal windups and accuracy, and their animations reflect their combat aptitude. The third and final training type is highly trained, which enables the faction to use cover fire like our trained factions, but unlike our trained factions, they are aggressively always searching for opportunities to flank their target. They also have slightly faster windups and improved accuracy with their weapons and skills. Additionally, they have quicker animations and transitions, which reflect their elite training. The fourth and last faction trait is tech level, which is pretty straightforward. It controls what kind of technology the faction has access to. So we scale from something like Molotovs and grenades and baseball bats, all the way to airburst grenades and flying drones. There's 4 different levels here that we split it up into: low, medium, high, and very high. So here's an example of our True Sons faction, who's defensive, organized, trained, and use medium tech. You'll hopefully see how they kind of spread out, and you'll also see them kind of attempt to flank the player in a bit.
On the enemy flank!
Our next example is our Outcast faction. Now, they're aggressive, they're disorganized. Now, they're trained like the True Sons, but they have low tech. So since they're aggressive, you're going to see them kind of push up a lot quicker. And you also see this NPC abandoning cover and circle strafing around the target. Our third example are the Hyenas faction. They're aggressive, like the Outcasts, but they're disorganized and they're untrained. But, by contrast, they have access to high tech, so you'll see the green laser dazzler that's being used in the back by the sniper. You'll see them push forward, a lot similar to the Outcasts, but you'll also see them kind of slowly move away from cover occasionally, and that's because of their untrained aspect. Our fourth and last faction are the Black Tusk, who are defensive, organized, highly trained, very high tech. They are an endgame faction, so they are intended to be kind of the ultimate challenge to the player. So you notice how they kind of keep their distance. You'll also notice that they really aggressively flank. There we just saw an explosive flying drone. So hopefully that kind of gives a demonstration of how our different faction traits work to create some differentiation between our factions.
Serious trauma detected.
The second area of improvement we identified through our team retrospective was keeping all our factions relevant at endgame and the importance of doing that. In the Division, we had a very stepping stone approach to our factions. We start off with the easier, less complex factions, and then we work our way up to the more complex and difficult faction. Now, this was really useful for teaching the mechanics of the game at a good pace and continually challenging the player over time. But the problem of that, of course, was that the early game factions aren't really useful at all in endgame, especially when the player has the gear and the tools, but also the knowledge and the skill to easily deal with these threats. In the Division 2, however, we attempted to make 3 of the main factions faced during the campaign of the game balanced with one another. Now, in order to do this, we balanced the faction traits that you previously saw. And we did that to kind of provide an outcome that made them relatively similar in difficulty. So, for example, we take the hyenas, which have high tech, which is a really good faction trait to have, but we offset that with the fact that they're untrained. Now, one of the advantages of making factions equal with one another in terms of difficulty is that you lack a simple, easy challenge for new players at the start of the game. And we would also lack an ultimate challenge at endgame. Now, in order to accomplish these ambitions, we created a tutorial-specific faction for the beginning of the game. And that would kind of teach the basic mechanics of the game: cover usage, skill usage, weapon usage, repairing. Now, we would then take that faction and we'd throw it away after the beginning of the game. Now, I realize that sounds extravagant, but it actually wasn't. We simply took a few core archetypes from the hyenas faction, we stripped them down to kind of their core abilities, and we slowed down their movement speed, we slowed down the rate at which they gain accuracy, we really stripped down the complexity as much as possible. Now, to the player, this is mostly invisible. And if you combine that with the rollout plan that we have with our archetypes, which unlock at each mission, we kind of gradually introduce complexity and difficulty throughout the course of the game. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we have the endgame only faction, the Black Tusks, which you saw earlier, and we use those for cadenced events and the highest difficulties available in the endgame. And that's mostly for our most hardcore players. The next area of improvement identified was that there wasn't enough differentiation in the NPC archetypes themselves when we compared them across the factions. So that led to the enemies feeling a bit samey. To address this in Division 2, we diversified the archetypes in the different factions as much as possible while we retained kind of their core archetype challenge. We kept the same core gameplay challenges from the Division 1 for the sequel: target prioritization, target ordering, repositioning, positioning, endurance minimization, endurance. All those things are in our previous GDC talk, so if you want to know more about that, you can see that. And we use them in making our archetypes feel more different from one another in the various factions. Since we have 64 completely unique NPCs and behaviors, almost double what we had in the first game, this was a bit of a difficult process, and we leaned heavily onto these archetype challenges. So here's an example which helps illustrate this, hopefully. Here are 2 snipers in our different factions. Both have the exposure minimization challenge, but they go about it in a pretty different way. The True Sun sniper is a pretty typical sniper for the Division franchise in that she has a bit of a wind-up and then she hits really hard if the player is still exposed, right? But to kind of twist things up a little bit, we also allow her to go prone, which makes her a lot harder to hit. The Outcast sniper, on the other hand, uses a bow with explosive tipped arrows. Well, it's also a similar challenge. There's a wind-up, there's a hard hit if the player is still exposed. The arrow, because it flies through the air, the player can dodge it, but there's a small AoE explosion on the tip of the arrow with a fuse. So here's a video of the True Sun sniper. Notice that she's prone right now. She's kind of hard to see, kind of hard to hit. When the player is exposed, they're going to get hit, take a lot of damage. Now compare that to the Outcast sniper, who's winding up his bow. You can see the arrow fly through the air there. There's a small AoE explosion. So notice it's fairly easy to dodge if you're kind of aware of it. Another area of improvement for the Division 2 was to remove some of the tedious maintenance of our behaviors by sharing more of them across different NPCs. When we started on the Division 2, one of the first priorities was to re-engineer the behavior trees to share 2 additional elements that weren't previously shared: movement and shooting. Now, both of these have a lot of complexities, backups, fail-safes, and they quickly became problematic maintaining them throughout the life of the Division. Especially since we are essentially doubling the amount of behavior trees and NPCs in the Division 2, this became critical. So let's take a look at one of our behavior trees here. So here's an image of a behavior tree. The first thing to note is that our behavior tree reads right to left and top to bottom. Now, there are reasons why we do this. I won't get into that now. Suffice to say, we talked about changing this 3 years ago, and we haven't. But you'll notice that there only appear to be a few nodes visible. Now, that's because we've hidden most of the complexity in groups or reusable subgraphs we call compound nodes. Because our behavior trees are pretty low level and extremely powerful, organization and reuse is critical, especially considering each behavior tree typically contains tens of thousands of nodes. On the furthest point to the right is where we start. This is a compound node that contains our pseudo-state machine for our NPCs that controls their various detection states and other pre-combat states. Next, we flow into these 2 nodes, which we call critical events. Now, this controls how the NPCs react to anything that's really high priority, such as reaction to a player grenade or a player skill, status effects, but it also contains the logic for how our NPCs handle objectives and scripted control. While both of these appear in typically every behavior tree, we modify how the various NPCs react to the events by changing the different input pins on the left side. Now, if we don't match any conditions in that critical events, we flow to the main combat part of our behavior tree. Now, this is, of course, our True Son's engineer, and his base combat controls everything about setting up, repairing, moving a turret, and also it contains everything about fighting from cover, when he should reload, when he wants to reposition, all of those things. Now, from there, if we get a movement request, and this is a new change that we made, we flow into our movement nodes. Now, our movement nodes, everything gets funneled through here, which makes them easy to maintain, and we simply modify how the NPCs move with those input pins on the left. Finally, on the left are the compound nodes that handle shooting. Now, similar to movement, we funnel all shoot requests to these nodes, and all of that complexity is handled there. Now, again, we use those input nodes to kind of alter the way it works. If you're curious about how our behavior trees work and you want a lot more in-depth detail, we actually have a real-time demonstration that we're doing Thursday at the UB Lounge, so please stop by and see us. The next area of improvement that was really important to us was improving the hit reactions. We felt like that was a big area of improvement that we could have made in the Division 1 because shooting the enemies felt kind of unrewarding, especially considering that we're an RPG and shooting enemies takes a bit longer in our game, especially if you compare it to a more straightforward action game. In the Division, we essentially had 2 different types of hit reactions: flinches and staggers. Now, flinches are entirely client-side and thus cosmetic, so they don't affect gameplay in any way, whereas staggers are server-side and affect the gameplay. They're basically mini stuns. In The Division 2, we kept these and we really focused on pronouncing the flinches in particular, because they're the basic per-hit feedback that the player would see thousands of times throughout the game. In addition to that, we added body part-specific death animations, which helped add the feeling of reactiveness to the NPCs during combat. And as any good AI programmer or designer knows, the way the NPCs die is really important to their perception. Next, we felt that there wasn't enough skill required to successfully aim at and shoot enemies, meaning that we had to increase their health and armor in order to kind of compensate for that. So we therefore tried to make our enemies more difficult to hit overall. We accomplished this by adding active dodging and ducking when an NPC is shot at nearby. So we did this by just detecting if the NPC's larger, very simple hitbox, what we call detection hitbox, is hit, and then we force the NPC to play a layered animation where they duck down their head and they try to avoid standing too still. Now, this meant it was more difficult for the player to stay on target without adjusting their aim, and that, of course, requires skill. It also has the side benefit of making the NPC appear to protect their own life and look a lot more human-like. Now, a bit of a tangent, but I want to say before we move forward that it's a really good idea to become friends with the people who are working on player abilities if you're working on AI. It's a bit of a dance sometimes to get things right, and one of the things that we often discussed on The Division 2 was giving the players less accuracy and more recoil to their weapons, especially the full auto weapons, so they couldn't just empty full mags into an unsuspecting enemy. Another aspect of increasing the aim challenge for players was the addition of destructible armor plating. Enemies with this feature could be covered in armored segments that covered each leg, each arm, the torso, and the head, and each piece had its own health. Now, destroying a piece of destructible armor plating would quickly expose the squishy human flesh underneath and allow the player to quickly kill the enemy. So this feature not added a lot better contextualization for our very tanky enemies, really important for an RPG, but it also offers additional tactics and aim challenge, right? The most efficient way of kind of destroying or defeating this enemy is to eat away at a single piece, which means tactically and skill-wise, it's a little bit challenging. And additionally, it's just really fun to blow armor off of these guys. So here's a video example of our Outcast tank. So there, the helmet is now blown off. Now the chest is gone. So notice how quickly he dies here after I start shooting the enemy. While weak points existed in the original Division, we expanded on them much more in the Division 2. We added them to most enemies in the game, and we diversified them much more. In addition to providing an aim challenge to the player, they're typically small and sometimes require repositioning in order to, or even distracting an NPC. They allow a quick way for skilled players to dispatch enemies, and we reward their accuracy and their tactics. Now, we also tie all weak points to the different abilities of enemy NPCs, so destroying the grenade pouch of a thrower would prevent them from using grenades, or destroying the shock pads of the True Sun's medic would prevent him from reviving his allies. We added a lot of variety of these effects that the player can play around with. The next area of improvement we identified was the shooter combat challenge not being great enough. The Division 2 is a third-person shooter RPG, and we really wanted to improve the shooter aspect of the game. So if the RPG was up here in the last game and the shooter was here, we wanted to bring the shooter up here to match it. In order to challenge the player as a shooter a bit more, while also kind of incentivizing some of the more useful crowd control techniques in the player's toolbox, we improved the tactics and decision-making of our NPCs during combat. This is a bit easier said than done, but in order to do this, it basically required a lot of rapid iteration and testing and great tools. Luckily, we were able to use post-launch in the Division to try out some of the new core combat behaviors, such as aggressive flanking, retreating, and aggressively pushing up on the target, depending on the circumstances. The first testbed for this was the Hunter AI in the Survival DLC. Hunters were some of our most lauded and popular AI in the game, and we learned some really good lessons from developing them. We later created an LMB variant for our legendary missions in post-launch, which also helped give us a good environment for testing out those learnings from the Hunter, but in an archetype-specific way. Now, we used all of these learnings and these behaviors as our starting point in the Division 2 for our AI. So, improving the hit reactions, making NPCs more protective of their lives by actively dodging incoming fire, adding more contextualization to the concept of armor, generally making NPCs more challenging, our emphasis on weak points and ensuring that all our normal NPCs, something I haven't mentioned, our red bars, that they remain in the game at all difficulty levels. And all of those things combined allowed us to lower the time to kill on our enemies. Now, the survivability is roughly in the same place in the Division 1, but the important part is that it takes much less or much fewer bullets to kill an enemy now. Now, this rewards our skilled players, but really importantly, it keeps combat feeling snappy and satisfying. I'm going to pass the podium over to Phil Dunstan, our lead AI programmer, and he'll talk about some of the more technical aspects.
Good morning. When we first moved on to the development of the Division 2, we knew we were going to be on a very short development cycle. We had approximately 2 years between rolling onto the project and the release. So we knew we had to be somewhat conservative with the large system changes that we're making in the game. If you saw one of our talks in 2016, or you listened to Drew talk then, you'll know that we're very proud of our behavior tree system, its editor and its debugger. We think it fits very closely with the gameplay mechanics that we want to create and the way we want to write NPC behaviors. Similarly, we were very pleased with our core combat mechanics, our detection system, our threat prioritization, our position evaluation. So we didn't want to make significant changes to these systems. We did have a couple of systems where we knew we were going to have to spend a lot of time. Looking at the final sort of development of the Division, we spent a lot of time debugging issues with navigation and NPC locomotion. NavMesh generation system was a little bit unreliable. Technical limitations in our pathfinding restricted the distance that we could reliably move the NPCs. NPC locomotion was a problem where we had desyncs between the client and the server as a result of our motion plan generation. So we knew we had to solve these problems. These problems, however, I think were quite specific to our engine and our technology, and so were the solutions. So I'm not going to talk about these today. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk about them at length after this session. Most of the other changes we wanted to make were generally small iterations on the existing systems as new gameplay features were added. However, there are a couple of places where we want to focus our energies. And I'm going to talk about one of those specific points today. One of the complaints of Tom Clancy's The Division was that the open world could feel empty of NPCs. We had placed encounters where the player could engage with NPCs, but otherwise there weren't too many NPCs around. And it was very difficult to tell what they were doing. So we really want to solve sort of 3 questions with respect to our open world NPCs. We want to solve the problem with, why are the NPCs there? What motivation do they have? What information are we able to give the NPCs about their environment? And how do we use that information to improve the player experience? Generally, these questions are easier to solve for combat encounters, especially linear story missions, because we have a strong narrative. It's easy for players to give motivation to a group of NPCs that's trying to kill them. And we have the mechanism in place for level design to provide information through the scripting mechanisms of the level. These are generally harder questions to solve for open world NPCs. So before we look at how we solved them for The Division 2, I'd like to step back and look at the tools that we had for The Division. The simplest tool we had, and a tool common to nearly every engine, is an animated sequence. These are interruptible animations involving one or more NPCs. These are great for quality. The NPCs look tightly connected to the environment. These animations are handcrafted, hand-placed to fit the environment in which they're going to play. They provide a direct link between the animators and the level designers and the narrative to the NPCs. As you can imagine, though, they lack replayability. The sequence is always going to play out in the same way. They're expensive to produce because we're handcrafting each of these. And so we often lack variation. We have a limited number of these in a limited number of locations. And finally, and this is very important to the questions that I posed earlier, they provide no context for the behaviors when those sequences are interrupted. All of that contextual information is encoded into the sequence itself. And the behaviors don't know what the NPC was trying to do before the systemic behaviors took over. Another simple tool we had on The Division was roaming NPCs. These are groups of NPCs following a hand-placed path throughout the world. These are great for adding variety, and they set up emergent gameplay as the groups of roaming NPCs intercept the player when the player is engaged in another encounter or is moving through the world. However, similar to animated sequences, they don't provide any context to the behaviors of the NPCs when those NPCs are interrupted. A third tool we had on The Division was contextual action points. And a contextual action point is generally a short animation that is attached to a prop or directly placed in the world. And this might be something like an NPC looking through a car window or leaning against a tree smoking a cigarette. You can think of these as not very clever smart objects. It's really just an animation in the world. The NPC idle behavior would select a contextual action point. The NPC would move to that location and play that animation. And then the idle behavior would select another position. These provide a great amount of variation for NPCs as they string together different sets of small animations. But on their own, they lack coherency. There is nothing driving the selection of one action point based on the previously played animation. On The Division, we tried to add an extra layer on top of the contextual action points using a needs-based system where the NPCs would have a need to patrol or to guard or to relax. But we found without a lot of additional realization that we didn't have, this motivation was unreadable to the player. And this system was cut early during development. Similar to the problem I've mentioned with sequences and roaming NPCs, contextual action points provide no context to the behavior. And this is a theme that we had throughout these simple tools. We tried to solve this with NPC objectives. So I talked about NPC objectives in our GDC 2016 presentation, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. An NPC objective is generally a sort of scripted motivation for a group of NPCs with markup in the world provided by level design. An example of NPC objective might be something like investigating an area, defending an area, or defending a very important person. NPC objectives have the advantage that they can modify systemic behaviors. We can unlock behaviors specific to each of the objective types. They rely on the systemic behaviors rather than a lot of handcrafted animations, and they're faster to produce than sequences. And they work well, but unfortunately in the division we had a limited number of objectives available to our NPCs. And most of these objectives were applicable to combat encounters, either once combat had already begun or when combat was imminent. And so they were generally used in our main missions. NPC objectives provide a purpose, but it generally tends to be pretty shallow. It applies to the whole group. We can't provide any individual purpose through the objective itself. And so that's the problem, one of the problems that we want to solve looking forward at the Division 2. So in the Division 2, all of these tools are still available. We're going to start then looking at the first question of answering why the NPCs exist in the open world. And we tackled that first question by modifying our game design. We decided early on that we didn't want to have idle NPCs or NPCs simply just wandering through the world. NPCs should always be doing something. They should always have a purpose. And so we came up with the concept of living world activities. A living world activity provides a reason for the NPCs to be in the open world. And this could be something like a gather resources activity, or taking over a control point, or executing a group of hostages. Living world activities would be driven by the needs of the settlements and the outposts in the world. So a living world activity is built as a sequence of open world objectives. For example, the gather resources activity would start with a NPC spawning at a settlement and traveling through the open world. As the NPCs approach the activity site, they would enter an approach objective, where they would cautiously approach and check out if there are any other NPCs. They would then enter a gather resources objective, and here one NPC might gather the resources and put them in a box, and the other NPCs would take up guard positions or overwatch positions. Once that's complete, the NPCs would travel back through the world and return back to their settlement where they would despawn. Each of these objectives was a new objective for the Division 2. As I mentioned earlier, objectives apply a motivation to the complete fire team, but we now want to provide individual purpose during an objective. And so we came up with a concept called an NPC duty. A duty can be thought of as a role during an activity. It could be a special role. This is one that's assigned at the start of an activity and is maintained throughout that activity. In the gather resources objective this would be our resource gatherer duty. In our control point takeover activity, this would be our control point officer. Or a duty could be an unscripted role, one that's assigned ad hoc as the objective changes during an activity. And this would be something like our Overwatch lookout duty, our guard duty, or a mounted weapon duty if there is a mounted weapon gun available. Coupled with our NPC duties, we had a concept of an NPC post. An NPC post is a position in the world where an NPC can perform an action specific to a duty during an objective. And this could include things like an NPC post volume, where an NPC could perform a gather resources duty, or an overwatch duty, or a guard duty. Or a post could be a waypoint path, where an NPC could perform a patrol duty. Or a mounted weapon gun, where the NPC could perform a mounted weapon duty. We were inspired here somewhat by Naughty Dog's GDC 2017 presentation, where they showed using their concept of an NPC post to control the positioning of NPCs during combat. Here, we want to leverage level designers for marking up an activity site with information that the NPCs can use to choose the appropriate behaviors. NPC objectives link all of the NPC posts that an NPC can perform during that objective. NPC posts also specify the supported NPC duties for that post, the location that duty can be performed, and the minimum number of NPC required to be assigned during an objective. So let's look at how NPC duty and NPC post assignment works. To start with, we assign the special duties. These are the ones that are assigned at the start of the activity. So this might be the resource gatherer duty for the gather resources activity. In the diagram I'm showing here, this is an activity site where an NPC is going to perform a gather resources objective. In the center, the blue volume in the center, is a volume post with a resource gatherer duty. And here, an NPC will play caps that have the NPC picking up apples and putting them into a box. On the right is an elevated Overwatch lookout position, where an NPC can perform an Overwatch duty. And on the left is a volume where an NPC can perform a guard duty. So when the objective changes during an activity, we enter the gather resources objective. And we try and assign first NPCs that already have a duty. Because we are running the resource gather activity, we have gather resources NPCs, and they are going to be assigned to that gather resource post volume. We then try and assign NPCs to the mandatory NPC posts. These are the NPC posts with the minimum number of required NPCs. In this example, we may require that an NPC takes that Overwatch lookout position. And we were trying to assign one of our NPCs in our NPC group to that post. We may also require that we have a guard NPC in that guard post, and an NPC would be assigned from the available NPCs. And then finally, we try to assign any remaining NPCs to any of the unfulfilled posts. In this case, the guard post may be able to take a second NPC, and we can assign an NPC there. In the same way, the NPC posts can specify the range of NPC duties that can be performed at that post. Each NPC archetype can also specify a list of the allowed duties that NPC can perform. An example of this is the elevated Overwatch position. We wouldn't want a rusher NPC, a melee NPC, for example, to be assigned to that post. So this is a classic computer science optimization problem. We're trying to find a good solution for assigning NPCs to the possible duties from all the feasible solutions, with the constraints of the type of duties available and the type of duties that each NPC can be assigned. Fortunately for us, we don't need a perfect solution. In fact, in our engine, we used something just a little bit more clever than a greedy algorithm, and it gave us all the results we needed. One of the advantages of NPC posts is that we can solve the problem with maintaining continuity between the out-of-combat and the in-combat behaviors. An NPC post can specify whether an NPC should be unassigned from that post at the start of combat. Because the NPC duties have unlocked custom behaviors within the objective behaviors, we can use NPC behaviors to control when an NPC is unassigned from a post. An example would be a sniper in an elevated Overwatch position. Now, typically, a sniper's systemic behaviors has the sniper try to maintain an optimal distance from any target. As the target approaches the sniper will try to back away to maintain that optimal distance. However, if we know we're trying to assign a sniper into an elevated position, we might want them to stay in that position for much longer than their systemic behaviors would allow. And because we have control of the behaviors, we've specialized the behaviors for the NPC duties, we can control that within the behaviors to override the general systemic behaviors. and have them break that NPC post only when the target is very close. Also, we can maintain continuity between combat and back into out of combat. By not unassigning the NPC duties on an NPC, we have that information to use when we go back into the out of combat state. In our game, the resource gatherer NPC will carry a box of resources back towards the settlement. If combat breaks out, they drop the box and they enter their normal systemic combat behaviors. When combat is finished, they still have that resource gatherer duty though, and we can use that behavior to then have them move to that position, pick the box back up, and continue their walking back to the settlement. So NPC duties, NPC posts, solved a lot of the problems that we had with providing motivation to NPCs. They provide purpose for NPCs at both the group and individual level, and they connect information from level design to the NPC systemic behaviors. We did find that the interaction between NPC duties and posts can be somewhat confusing to level designers. Some duties, and game designers, some duties assign posts from duties from script, some from NPC posts. Some duties don't need posts, and yet other duties need specific post types. We think this was really a problem with a sort of lack of complete tools that we're able to give to the designers, and we can solve this with better validation of the tools, in the tools that the designers use. So duties and posts help us to choose suitable behaviors for NPCs based on their environment. Our next step now is to try and use that to improve the player experience. We wanted to improve our cap selection and our dialogue selection with information from the environment. And this would include things like information from the time of day, the weather, and the purpose of the NPC in an activity. I'm going to talk mainly about bark selection in the next couple of slides, but the tools we use here are the same tools that we can improve the contextual action point selection when an NPC is in a post volume. In 2012, Elon Ruskin introduced a rule-based system for choosing dialogue lines. This became extremely popular, and if you've been at GDC the last couple of years, or you've seen any AI talks on the Vault, you almost certainly would have seen a team using a rule-based system for dialogue matching. We decided instead that we would go with a tag matching system. Tag matching system is not a new idea, but we think it's useful to talk about tag matching as a comparison to the recent discussion of rule-based systems. In a rule-based system, a dialogue line is selected as a candidate for playing if it matches a series of conditional predicates. This might be, is it raining outside? Is the target health at less than 10% health? And is the target wielding a pistol? In a tag matching system, these conditional predicates are turned into the existence of a single tag. So we might have a tag for weather raining, or a tag for target health less than 10%. We decided that this was sufficient for us and we didn't need the full functionality of a rule-based system. And it fit much better into a short development cycle. Tags are significantly easy to understand by designers. It's easy for us to create tools for authoring and debugging tags. And importantly, it's really easy for us to modify the existing tools used by narrative and audio designers. It's easy to create new tags without requiring programmer involvement. In our engine, creating a new tag would require modifying a couple of data files, and then that tag would be available to the audio, to the narrative designer writing dialogue lines. And importantly for us, tags are inherently fast. We are a server-based AI game. All of our AI, including our bark selection, is done on the server. And so it's important that we can fit as many players as we possibly can onto a given server. Rules are more powerful. You can have specific conditions like agents is less than 10% health. And doing this in a tag-based system might require having very specific tags that need to be evaluated every frame. In our engine, we had the ability to lazily evaluate tags. If we came across a dialogue line that was testing for the existence of a health is less than 10% tag, we could lazily evaluate the condition at that point and add the tag for the tag to the tag container for subsequent checking. So let's look at the tags on an agent. And an agent here can be either a player or an NPC. The tags we have on an agent include things like the NPC archetype, the faction, the activity of the NPC, and this might be driven from the NPC duties or the NPC activities. It would include information about whether the agent is in a group or solo, and the gear of the agent has, whether it's the weapons equipped or the player specialization being used. Each agent also inherits tags from their environment. So these could be tags from a prop. If an agent is a cover, we pass the tag information from that prop onto the agent so that we can do a dialogue line that is specific to an agent being hiding behind an ambulance or a car. Agents can inherit tags from volumes. So this could be something like this landmark, the White House is visible from this area. Or they can inherit tags from the environment, the time of day, and the weather. When we request a bark line, the request comes from behavior. Behavior has the context information about what the dialogue line that we're trying to choose. This context information is passed through as a stimulus, and this could be something derived from the NPC duty, or it could be in response to an AI event that the AI is responding to in the world, such as a grenade landing next to an agent. Agents match tags based on both when we match tags, we base the matching based on both the tags on the agent and on the target agent that the NPC is talking about, whether that's the hostile target or the target, another NPC that the agent is talking to about. And we choose the lines with the most matching tags. Lines also have a chance to play. They can be rare or common, and they have cooldowns. And finally, we have a call and response stimulus, so we can generate call and response type of conversations. Tags were a great success for us. We were able to fit them into a short development cycle, and early enough so that narrative could set them up on their dialogue lines, and so that the world environment artists or environment editors could add tags to all the props and to their world. Many of the the positives I talked about as the reason for using tags proved to be true. And we're able to create a tag system that was easy to debug, easy to author, and easy to reuse for other systems. Many of the drawbacks from tags mirror the drawbacks that we've heard recently from rule-based systems. The most matching tags policy is generally not sufficient on its own. You need concepts like chance to play and cooldowns to control frequency. Bark lines with a narrow set of tags are cool, like this NPC is hiding behind an ambulance in the rain using a pistol. But the production reality is that the significantly reduced chance to play for that line to get the matching conditions reduces its usefulness in an environment where you're trying to produce a lot of dialogue lines. And finally, we found that tags could actually be misused as an information store. At some stage during our development, it became possible to query from behavior the tags on an agent. And we found systemic behaviors that now sort of are tested on conditions based on what's in our tag container. This was not really the intention of tags, and it sort of mirrors the tags become a little bit like a blackboard. And we need to investigate further the implications of this. So today, we've talked about a lot of the changes we've made for the Division 2. We're really proud of the changes like the addition of clear faction traits, the better archetype differentiations. Our players are really pleased with the additional combat difficulty and the shorter time to kill from things like our hit reactions, our weak points, and our destructible armor. The improved NPC contextualization in the world through NPC objectives, the activities, and then the corresponding NPC duties and posts have proved to be really successful, and we've been able to use that information to better realize the NPC behaviors. I'd like to make a special thanks here to the NPC and gameplay teams at both Ubisoft Massive and Ubisoft Annecy. All of the technology that I've talked about here today was co-developed between Massive and our co-dev partners, Annecy. As Drew mentioned, Drew and I are doing a presentation at the Ubisoft Lounge at 2 p.m. on Thursday. Come along to find out more about how we structure the NPC behaviors. And we're including a live demonstration within our editor and our debugger of showing the AI tools that we use. And finally, Ubisoft is hiring worldwide, but particularly Ubisoft Massive in Malmö. If you'd like to come and work in Sweden, we'd love to talk to you as well. Thank you very much.